The morning mist clung to the waters of New York Harbor like a shroud, but beneath its deceptive tranquility, the greatest armada in British history was assembling for war. General George Washington stood on the heights of Brooklyn, his weathered hands gripping the brass telescope as he counted the white sails that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. It was July 1776, and the fledgling American colonies had declared their independence just weeks before. Now, the full might of the British Empire was arriving to crush this audacious rebellion before it could take root. The sight that greeted Washington would have broken the spirit of lesser men. More than 400 ships dotted the harbor, there, masts creating a forest of timber and canvas that stretched beyond the horizon. Aboard these vessels were 32,000 of the finest soldiers in the world, including battle-hardened British regulars and the feared Hessian mercenaries whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had terrorized Europe for decades. General William Howe, the British commander, had learned from the bloody lessons of Bunker Hill and was determined not to underestimate these colonial rebels again. Washington's own force seemed pitiful by comparison, barely 19,000 men, most of them inexperienced militia who had never faced professional soldiers in open battle. They had rushed to New York after the British evacuation of Boston in March, correctly anticipating that the Crown's next target would be the strategic port city that controlled the Hudson River and access to the interior colonies. The importance of New York could not be overstated. Its loss would effectively cut New England off from the southern colonies, dividing the rebellion when unity was its only hope for survival. As referenced in historical accounts from the American battlefield, trust, the Continental Army's position was precarious from the start. Washington had made the difficult decision to split his forces between Manhattan and Long Island, a strategy that violated every principle of military concentration, but seemed necessary to defend both approaches to the city. He placed his most reliable generals in command of the Brooklyn positions. Nathanael Greene, whose tactical brilliance had already proven invaluable, was struck down by fever at the crucial moment and replaced by John Sullivan, a capable but less experienced officer. Israel Putnam, the grizzled veteran of the French and Indian War, took overall command of the Brooklyn defenses. The American fortifications on Brooklyn Heights were impressive on paper, but revealed dangerous weaknesses upon closer inspection. The main defensive line ran roughly 2 miles from Gowanus Bay to Wallabout Bay, anchored by Fort Sterling on the left and Fort Putnam on the right. Between these strong points, hastily constructed earthworks and wooden palisades provided cover for the defenders. But the Americans had made a fatal error in their deployment. They had failed to adequately guard the Jamaica Pass, a route through the hills that could allow an enemy force to circumvent their entire defensive position. The men who occupied these positions came from every corner of the rebelling colonies. There were Massachusetts fishermen who had never seen a battle, Pennsylvania farmers clutching muskets they barely knew how to load, and Virginia riflemen whose accuracy with their long weapons was legendary. Among them stood the 1st Maryland Regiment, resplendent in their blue and buff uniforms, their discipline and training marking them as the closest thing America had to professional soldiers. These men would soon earn a reputation that would echo through the corridors of history. As the British continued their methodical preparations, Washington found himself caught between impossible choices. Every instinct told him to consolidate his forces, to abandon Brooklyn and defend Manhattan where the terrain favored the defender. But political considerations weighed heavily on his mind. To abandon Long Island without a fight would send a message of weakness to allies he desperately needed, both at home and abroad. The French were watching, waiting to see if these American rebels could stand against European military might before committing their own resources to the cause. The weather itself seemed to conspire against the Americans as August arrived with oppressive heat and humidity that sapped the strength of men unaccustomed to such conditions. British ships continued to disgorge their human cargo on Staten Island, where Howe established his base of operations. From there, the British general could survey his options while his forces rested and prepared for the coming assault. He knew that time was on his side. With each passing day, his overwhelming advantage in numbers, training, and equipment would tell more heavily against the amateur soldiers arrayed against him. In the camps around Brooklyn, American sentries peered through the darkness toward the enemy positions, knowing that somewhere across the water, the most powerful military machine in the world was preparing to test their resolve. The fate of a nation hung in the balance. and the dawn of August 27th would bring the first great trial of American independence. The pre-dawn darkness of August 27th, 1776, was shattered by the distant rumble of artillery as British guns opened fire along the American lines. But this bombardment was merely a feint, designed to mask the true nature of General Howe's masterstroke. While American attention focused on the obvious frontal assault developing near the Gowanus Bay, 10,000 British and Hessian soldiers were already deep into their flanking march through the unguarded Jamaica Pass. Moving like ghosts through the pre-dawn mist, Major General James Grant led the diversionary attack on the American right, his Scottish troops advancing with parade ground precision against the positions held by Lord Stirling and his Delaware and Maryland regiments. The sound of their approach, the measured beat of drums, the screech of fifes, and the rhythmic tramp of boots announced their presence long before they came into view. This was precisely what Howe intended. The noise would draw American attention and reserves toward this secondary threat, while his main force completed its envelopment. The responsibility for the Jamaica Pass had fallen to a small patrol of 5 American officers, a force laughably inadequate for such a crucial position. These brave men, isolated and outnumbered, could do nothing but watch in horror as column after column of enemy soldiers streamed past their hidden observation post. The British had moved with remarkable stealth, their advance guided by local loyalists who knew every path and trail through the heavily wooded hills. By the time the sun began to rise, Howe's main force was already behind the American lines, ready to spring their trap. Lieutenant General Henry Clinton commanded the flanking force, a collection of the finest regiments in the British Army. The 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers marched alongside the 33rd Foot, their scarlet uniforms a stark contrast to the green foliage around them. Hessian Jägers, elite marksmen whose skill with their rifles was legendary, moved through the woods like predators stalking their prey. These were not the reluctant conscripts that American propaganda portrayed, but professional soldiers who had dedicated their lives to the art of war, as referenced in detailed military histories, including those from Mount Vernon's archives. Washington remained on Manhattan, trusting his subordinates to manage the Brooklyn defenses while he coordinated the overall strategic picture. This decision, though tactically sound, would prove costly as events unfolded with lightning speed across the East River. The general had established an efficient signal system using flags and cannon shots to maintain communication with his Brooklyn commanders, but the fog of war would soon render these systems inadequate for the rapidly evolving crisis. The first sign of disaster came not from any official report, but from the terrified faces of American patrol members who came stumbling back through the lines with tales of massive enemy columns moving through their rear. Initially dismissed as the panicked exaggerations of inexperienced soldiers, these reports gained credibility as more witnesses arrived with identical stories. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the awful truth was becoming clear. The Americans had been outmaneuvered on a grand scale. General Sullivan, commanding the American center, found himself in an impossible position. His men were deployed in a thin line facing south, expecting the main British attack to come from that direction. Now he learned that enemy forces were moving behind him in overwhelming numbers, threatening to cut off his retreat to the Brooklyn Heights fortifications. The tactical situation was rapidly becoming untenable, but military protocol and personal pride demanded that he stand and fight, rather than order an immediate withdrawal that might be seen as cowardice. The sound that would haunt American survivors for the rest of their lives began to echo through the morning air, the distinctive hunting horns of British light infantry, blown in a prearranged signal that announced the completion of the flanking movement. These haunting notes, combined with the wild cheering of advancing enemy soldiers, created a psychological effect that was as devastating as any artillery barrage. Many American militiamen, hearing these sounds from multiple directions, simply abandoned their positions and fled toward what they hoped was safety. Colonel Samuel Atlee of the Pennsylvania Regiment found his position along Bedford Road suddenly untenable as British forces appeared on his flanks and rear simultaneously. His men, mostly farmers and tradesmen from the Philadelphia area, had never faced such a coordinated attack by professional soldiers. They fought with desperate courage, but their lack of training showed as their formations began to dissolve. Under pressure, those who escaped the initial contact brought word of the disaster to other American units, spreading panic through the ranks like wildfire. The morning that had begun with such hope for the American cause was rapidly turning into A nightmare of military disaster. Across the battlefield, small groups of Continental soldiers found themselves surrounded, their officers desperately seeking routes of escape that seemed to close with each passing minute. The British war machine, having successfully deployed itself in the enemy's rear, was now ready to begin the systematic destruction of Washington's army. The fate of American independence hung by the thinnest of threads, and that thread was rapidly fraying under the weight of superior British planning and execution. As the British trap closed around the scattered American forces, one unit stood, like a beacon of defiance against the overwhelming tide of defeat. The 1st Maryland Regiment, under the command of Major Mordecai Gist, found themselves facing an impossible tactical situation. As they realized the extent of the British flanking maneuver, rather than surrender or flee, these 400 men, in their distinctive blue and buff uniforms, made a decision that would echo through American military history. They would fight. Lord Stirling, the American commander, whose real name was William Alexander, had earned his title through disputed inheritance claims to a Scottish peerage, but his courage on this bloody morning was undeniable. As he watched his defensive line crumble under the weight of Grant's frontal assault and the devastating news of Clinton's flanking movement, Stirling made the agonizing decision to sacrifice his best troops to save what remained of the American army in Brooklyn. The mathematics of war were brutal and simple. Someone had to hold the British long enough for the other units to retreat to the safety of the Brooklyn Heights fortifications. The Marylanders occupied a stone farmhouse known as the Vec House, its thick walls providing some protection against the storm of British musket fire that was already beginning to rake their positions. From the upper windows, American marksmen could see the full extent of their predicament. Grant's regulars advancing from the south, Clinton's massive column wheeling into position from the east, and Hessian troops moving to cut off any retreat. Toward the Gowanus Creek, the young men from Baltimore, Annapolis, and the tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake Bay were about to face their first and, for many, their last battle. The British advance was a masterpiece of 18th century tactical coordination. The 42nd Royal Highland Regiment, their kilt swaying in the morning breeze, moved forward with the disciplined precision that had made them feared across Europe. Behind them came the Grenadiers, tall men selected for their physical presence and fighting ability, their distinctive miter caps making them easily recognizable targets for American riflemen. The sound of their approach, hundreds of hobnailed boots striking the ground in unison, the rattle of equipment, and the shouted commands of officers created a psychological pressure that few militia units could withstand. Major Gist walked among his men, his calm demeanor providing a steadying influence as the noose tightened around their position. These Marylanders were not professional soldiers, but they had trained together for months and had developed the unique cohesion that distinguishes effective military formations from mere armed mobs. Many were educated men from prominent families. Others were mechanics and laborers from Baltimore's bustling port district. What united them was their belief in the cause of American independence and their determination not to disgrace the flag they served under. As documented in contemporary accounts from the American Battlefield Trust, the fighting around the Vec House became some of the most intense of the entire battle. The British, expecting to face demoralized militia who would break at the first volley, instead encountered disciplined resistance that staggered them with its ferocity. American musket fire, carefully aimed and coordinated, began to thin the ranks of the advancing redcoats. For the first time that morning, the British advance hesitated as officers called for additional support to deal with this unexpected pocket of resistance. The tactical situation, however, remained hopeless for the Americans. British artillery, brought forward under the protection of infantry, began to systematically destroy the farmhouse that sheltered the Marylanders. Solid shot crashed through the stone walls, sending deadly fragments flying through the rooms where American soldiers sought cover. The wooden portions of the structure caught fire, filling the building with choking smoke that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Still, the Marylanders held their ground, knowing that every minute they delayed the British advance might save the lives of their retreating comrades. Lord Stirling, observing the battle from a small hill nearby, could see that his men were being slowly overwhelmed despite their heroic resistance. British reinforcements continued to arrive, extending their line and tightening the encirclement. The Gowanus Creek, normally a minor obstacle, had become swollen by recent rains and now presented a significant barrier to any American attempt at retreat. Those who tried to cross found themselves trapped in marshy ground, where they became easy targets for British marksmen positioned on the far bank. The moment that would define the Maryland Regiment's legend came when Sterling realized that a small gap remained in the British encirclement, a narrow corridor that might allow some of his men to escape. To keep this route open, someone would have to launch a desperate attack against superior numbers, buying time with blood. Without hesitation, Sterling ordered his men to fix bayonets and prepare for a charge that every man knew was likely to be his last. The young Marylanders, many of them barely out of their teens, gripped their weapons tighter and prepared to write their names in history with their sacrifice. As the morning sun climbed higher in the August sky, casting long shadows across the battlefield, 400 American soldiers prepared to demonstrate that the spirit of liberty could inspire ordinary men to extraordinary acts of courage. Their charge would not win the battle that was already lost, but it would prove that this new nation possessed something that could not be conquered by superior numbers or professional training, the willingness of free men to die for their beliefs. The command to advance echoed across the blood-soaked ground with the clarity of a bell, cutting through the smoke and chaos of battle. "Forward, Maryland!" Lord Sterling's voice carried the weight of desperate necessity as 400 men in blue and buff uniforms lowered their bayonets and prepared to charge into the very teeth of British military might. What followed would be remembered as one of the most gallant actions in American military history, a desperate gambit that exemplified the courage of men fighting for a cause greater than themselves. The target of their assault was a stone structure known as the Courteville farmhouse, now bristling with British muskets and crowned by the regimental colors of the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers. These veterans of European campaigns had established a strong defensive position, their lines anchored by the solid stone walls and protected by carefully positioned artillery pieces. Any rational military assessment would have declared an attack against such a position to be pure suicide, but rationality had little place in the cauldron of combat that Brooklyn had become. Major Mordecai Gist, his sword gleaming in the morning sun, led the charge from the front as Maryland tradition demanded. Behind him came the flower of that colony's young manhood, merchant sons from Baltimore, planters' boys from the eastern shore, and mechanics from Annapolis who had traded their tools for muskets in defense of liberty. Their cry, "Maryland, my Maryland," rose above the thunder of artillery as they advanced across ground that seemed to erupt with British musket balls seeking American flesh. The British defenders, initially stunned by the audacity of the attack, quickly recovered their professional composure and began to pour devastating fire into the advancing American ranks. The mathematics of warfare were brutally simple. Disciplined troops behind cover possessed an overwhelming advantage over attackers advancing across open ground. Yet the Marylanders pressed forward, their ranks thinning with each step, but their momentum never faltering. Men fell as their comrades stepped over their bodies, closing ranks and maintaining the attack formation that meant life or death for their retreating comrades. British Captain John Montreser, observing the action from a nearby hilltop, would later write in his diary that he had never witnessed such determined courage from colonial troops. The Marylanders fought with a desperation born of necessity, knowing that their sacrifice was the only thing standing between the British and the complete destruction of Washington's army. Each minute they held British attention was another minute for American units to withdraw across Gowanus Creek toward the questionable safety of the Brooklyn Heights fortifications, as documented in military histories from the Revolutionary War period. The charge reached the British lines with shocking impact despite the murderous fire they had endured. American bayonets found their marks as the survivors of the Maryland Regiment crashed into the Welsh Fusiliers' position like a human thunderbolt. For a brief, incredible moment, the professional soldiers of King George III wavered before the fury of these American rebels. Hand-to-hand combat raged around the farmhouse as men fought with bayonets, clubbed muskets, and bare fists in a struggle that transcended tactical considerations and became purely personal. But courage alone could not overcome the mathematical certainty of superior numbers and position. British reinforcements arrived to stabilize their line. Just as Hessian began to pour flanking fire into the American ranks, the Maryland Regiment, already reduced to less than half its original strength, found itself fighting on three sides simultaneously while more enemy units moved to complete their encirclement. Major Gist, his uniform torn and bloodied, realized that the moment for withdrawal had arrived if any of his men were to survive to fight. Another day. The retreat toward Gowanus Creek became a nightmare of confusion and terror as surviving Marylanders attempted to withdraw under intense enemy fire. The marshy ground around the creek, made treacherous by recent rains, claimed almost as many lives as British bullets. Men who had survived the charge found themselves trapped in sucking mud while enemy marksmen picked them off at leisure. Others, attempting to swim the swollen creek while carrying their heavy equipment, simply disappeared beneath the dark water and were never seen again. Lord Stirling himself became separated from his men during the chaotic withdrawal, finding himself surrounded by Hessian soldiers whose reputation for not taking prisoners was well established. Rather than surrender, he chose to fight his way toward the British lines where the rules of civilized warfare might offer better treatment. His capture by General James Grant marked the end of organized American resistance on this part of the battlefield, though scattered groups of Marylanders continued to fight their way toward safety through the gathering dust. Out of the 400 men who had advanced with such courage that morning, only a handful would answer roll call that evening. The 1st Maryland Regiment had been virtually destroyed, its sacrifice measured not in ground gained or enemies killed, but in time purchased for their retreating comrades. As the sun began to set over the waters of New York Harbor, painting the sky the color of blood, the magnitude of both the disaster and the heroism of this day was becoming clear to commanders on both sides of the conflict. The battle for Long Island was effectively over, but the spirit demonstrated by the Maryland Regiment would live on to inspire future generations of American soldiers. They had proven that free men, fighting for a cause they believed in, could stand against the finest professional soldiers in the world and make them pay dearly for their victory. As the sounds of battle gradually faded across the blood-soaked fields of Long Island, General George Washington stood on the ramparts of Fort Putnam, his face a mask of controlled despair as he surveyed the wreckage of his first major engagement. As commander-in-chief, the reports filtering back from his subordinates painted a picture of military catastrophe. Thousands of his men killed, wounded, or captured, entire regiments scattered to the winds, and his surviving forces trapped like rats in the Brooklyn Heights fortifications with their backs to the East River. The magnitude of the defeat was staggering in both tactical and strategic terms. General John Sullivan had been captured along with Lord Stirling, depriving Washington of two of his most experienced commanders at the moment he needed them most. The Delaware and Maryland regiments, among his most reliable units, had been virtually destroyed in their heroic but futile stands. The Pennsylvania and Connecticut militia, never fully reliable under the best of circumstances, were in complete disarray, many having thrown away their weapons in their panic to reach the safety of the fortified lines. British casualties, by contrast, had been remarkably light for such a decisive victory. General Howe's careful planning and professional execution had achieved exactly what he had intended: the destruction of American military power in the New York theater. With minimal cost to his own forces, the British commander now held every advantage: numerical superiority, control of the surrounding waters, and an enemy force trapped in an indefensible position with no apparent means of escape. Military logic suggested that the rebellion might be crushed within days. If Howe pressed his advantage, Washington's staff officers, gathered in the commander's tent as darkness fell over the battlefield, presented a catalog of disasters that would have overwhelmed a lesser man. Ammunition stocks were running dangerously low after the day's fighting. Medical supplies were inadequate to treat the hundreds of wounded men crying out in the makeshift hospitals, and food provisions were insufficient to sustain the remaining force for more than a few days. Perhaps most critically, morale had collapsed among troops who had witnessed the seemingly effortless destruction of their comrades by British regulars. The physical position of the American army was even more precarious than its material condition. The Brooklyn Heights fortifications, impressive though they appeared, were designed to defend against attack from the land side and offered little protection against naval bombardment from the British fleet now anchoring in the East River. Admiral Richard Howe, the British commander's brother, could bring his ship's guns to bear on the American positions at will, turning the supposedly secure base into a killing ground whenever he chose to open fire. As referenced in historical accounts from the Gilder Lehrman Institute, Washington faced what appeared to be an impossible choice between equally disastrous alternatives. He could order an immediate surrender, saving the lives of his remaining men, but effectively ending the rebellion before it had truly begun. He could attempt to hold the Brooklyn Heights positions, hoping that reinforcements might arrive from other colonies, but risking the complete destruction of his army through naval bombardment or siege. Or he could attempt the seemingly impossible, a nighttime evacuation across a mile of water, controlled by the enemy, under the very noses of professional soldiers who would show no mercy if they discovered the movement. The military precedents for such an evacuation were not encouraging. History was littered with the bones of armies that had attempted to withdraw across water barriers while under enemy observation, and Washington had neither the boats nor the experienced watermen necessary for such an operation. The East River, with its treacherous currents and tidal flows, had claimed the lives of experienced mariners in calm weather. Attempting to ferry thousands of soldiers across it in darkness, while maintaining absolute silence, seemed like a recipe for disaster on an even greater scale than the day's battle. Yet as Washington paced the confines of his headquarters, reviewing and discarding one desperate plan after another, he began to realize that the impossible evacuation might be their only hope for survival, the alternative waiting passively for British cannon to complete what their infantry had begun offered nothing but certain destruction. At least an evacuation attempt, however slim its chances of success, preserved the possibility that some portion of his army might live to fight another day. And as long as any organized American resistance remained in the field, the cause of independence could survive. The decision, when it finally came, was made with the quiet determination that would characterize Washington's leadership throughout the long years of war that lay ahead. He would attempt the evacuation, gambling everything on a single night's work that would require perfect coordination, absolute silence, and more luck than any rational man had a right to expect. The boats would have to be found, the routes planned, and the men prepared for an operation that might save the revolution, or ensure its destruction in the cold waters of the East River. As the general began to issue the preliminary orders that would set this desperate plan in motion, he was acutely aware that he was betting not just his own life and reputation, but the future of American independence on one night's work. The fate of a nation would depend on fog, tide, and the discipline of soldiers who had already been tested beyond their limits and found wanting. It was, Washington reflected grimly, exactly the sort of impossible situation that the cause of liberty seemed to demand of those who served it. The preparations for what would become known as one of the most audacious military evacuations in history began in the depths of despair, as Washington's remaining officers gathered in the flickering candlelight of his headquarters tent. The plan that emerged from their desperate deliberations was so fraught with peril that any rational military mind would have dismissed it as fantasy. Yet the alternative, certain destruction at the hands of British artillery, left them no choice but to attempt the impossible. Colonel John Glover of Marblehead emerged as the unlikely savior of the Continental Army. His regiment of Massachusetts fishermen and sailors possessing the specialized skills that would make the evacuation feasible. These weathered men, whose lives had been spent wrestling with the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, understood boats and tides in ways that landlocked soldiers never could. When Washington explained what he needed, Glover nodded grimly and began calculating tides, wind patterns, and the carrying capacity of every available watercraft in the area. The logistical challenges were staggering in their complexity. Nearly 9,000 men would have to be moved across a mile of open water in complete silence, along with their equipment, wounded comrades, and whatever supplies could be salvaged. Every boat, barge, and ferry in the vicinity would be needed, from fishing smacks to freight scows, pressed into service for this single night's desperate work. The margin for error was non-existent. Discovery by British patrols would mean the complete annihilation of American forces, trapped between enemy armies and the unforgiving river. Weather conditions seemed to conspire against the Americans as evening approached on August 29th. A stiff breeze from the northeast promised to make rowing difficult, while intermittent rain showers reduced visibility but also created noise that might mask the sounds of the evacuation. Most critically, the tide would be running against them for the first part of the night, requiring Glover's boatmen to fight both current and wind as they ferried their precious human cargo to safety on the Manhattan shore. The deception operations necessary to mask the withdrawal began as soon as darkness fell across the battlefield. American sentries maintained their normal patterns of movement and challenge calls, creating the illusion that the fortifications remained fully manned and alert. Campfires were kept burning throughout the night, their flickering light suggesting the presence of soldiers who were actually stumbling through the darkness toward the ferry points. The few remaining officers moved constantly along the lines, ensuring that no gap in the deception would alert British observers to what was transpiring. As documented in first-hand accounts from the New York Historical Society, the evacuation began with the wounded and the artillery, the most difficult elements to move quietly and quickly. Cannon wheels were wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound, while wounded men were carried on improvised stretchers that creaked ominously with each step. The loading points along the Brooklyn shore became scenes of controlled chaos as regiments that had never worked together attempted to coordinate movements in nearly complete darkness. The first boats to push off from shore carried their human cargo into what seemed like certain disaster. The wind had increased rather than diminished, creating whitecaps on the river that threatened to swamp the overloaded craft. Several boats began taking on water almost immediately, forcing their occupants to bail desperately while the oarsmen fought to maintain direction against the cross-currents. More than one vessel nearly foundered in the first hour, saved only by the skill of Glover's Marblehead men, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to read the water. British sentries, positioned on nearby ships and along the Staten Island shore, remained oblivious to the drama unfolding less than a mile away. The combination of wind, rain, and their own assumption that the Americans were trapped and helpless worked in favor of the evacuation. Occasionally, a guard would call out a challenge or fire a musket at shadows, but these sporadic alerts failed to trigger any coordinated response from the British command. General Howe, confident that his enemy was securely bottled up, had retired for the evening without posting additional watches. The pace of the evacuation, initially agonizingly slow, as men unfamiliar with boats struggled to board and disembark efficiently, began to accelerate as the night progressed. Regiments developed their own systems for moving men and equipment, while the boat crews gained experience with each trip across the treacherous waters. What had seemed impossible began to appear merely improbable as hundreds, then thousands, of soldiers disappeared into the Manhattan night like ghosts fleeing a haunted battlefield. Yet even as the evacuation gained momentum, disaster threatened from multiple quarters. Several boats were lost to the currents or wind, their occupants forced to swim for shore in the darkness. British patrols began to increase their activity as dawn approached, perhaps sensing something amiss in the unusual quiet from the American positions. Most critically, time was running out. Daylight would expose the evacuation to enemy observation and bring the inevitable destruction that Washington had risked everything to avoid. As the eastern sky began to show the first faint traces of gray that heralded the approaching dawn, thousands of American soldiers remained on the Brooklyn shore, still waiting for boats that might never come. The success of the entire operation and the survival of American independence itself would depend on the next few hours of desperate work in the growing light of a new day that might herald either salvation or catastrophe for the cause of liberty. Dawn was breaking over New York Harbor with the inexorable certainty of approaching disaster, as thousands of American soldiers still crowded the Brooklyn ferry points, their faces etched with the desperate knowledge that daylight meant discovery and destruction. General Washington, who had remained on the shore throughout the night to ensure that no man was left behind, could see British sentries beginning to stir in their positions. Less than 500 yards away, in minutes, perhaps seconds, the morning sun would illuminate the evacuation and bring the full weight of British artillery down upon the trapped Americans. Then, as if summoned by divine intervention, a thick fog began to roll in from the harbor, wrapping the evacuation in a protective shroud that made visibility impossible beyond a few yards. This was no gentle morning mist, but a dense, impenetrable wall of vapor that transformed the East River into an otherworldly realm where sounds were muffled and shapes became ghostly phantoms. The fog was so thick that men could barely see their own hands extended in front of their faces. Yet it provided exactly the concealment that Washington's desperate gamble required. Colonel Glover's Marblehead men, accustomed to navigating by compass and instinct in the worst weather conditions, found themselves uniquely suited to this supernatural environment, while land-based soldiers stumbled blindly through the murk. These experienced mariners continued their ferrying operations with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. Their intimate knowledge of tides, currents, and local waters allowed them to maintain course even when visibility dropped to mere feet, guiding their precious human cargo toward salvation on the Manhattan shore. The fog created its own set of challenges as disoriented soldiers struggled to find the ferry points. In the gray wilderness that the shoreline had become, officers used whispered commands and gentle touches to guide their men through the maze of confusion, while the boat crews worked by feel and sound to load their passengers safely. More than once, fully loaded craft pushed off from shore with men still trying to climb aboard, forcing agonizing decisions about whether to return for stragglers or proceed with those already saved. British sentries, now fully alert as the morning watch began, found themselves essentially blind to events transpiring only yards away. The fog that concealed the American evacuation also prevented effective British observation or response, turning professional soldiers into stumbling figures groping through a gray void. Occasional musket shots rang out as guards fired at sounds or shadows, but these random discharges failed to alert the British command to the magnitude of what was occurring under their very noses. As referenced in contemporary accounts from the Library of Congress, Washington himself remained at the ferry point until the very last boat, personally ensuring that every soldier who could be saved was loaded aboard the final craft. His presence provided a calming influence on men who were already stretched beyond their limits, demonstrating the leadership qualities that would sustain the Continental Army through 8 years of war. When junior officers urged him to board earlier boats, he quietly refused, stating that a commander's duty was to be the last man to leave a battlefield. The final phase of the evacuation became a race against time and nature. As the fog began to thin with the rising sun, British voices could be heard calling out in the growing light, suggesting that enemy patrols were beginning to investigate the unusual quiet from the American positions. The last boats to leave Brooklyn carried not just soldiers, but the hopes of a nascent nation whose independence hung by the slenderest of threads. One discovery, one alert British officer, one gap in the protective fog, and the entire American cause might have died in the waters of the East River. When the fog finally lifted completely, revealing the empty American fortifications to astonished British observers, General Howe's professional soldiers found themselves staring at one of the most complete and successful military evacuations in history. Not a single cannon had been left behind, virtually no supplies had been abandoned, and most incredibly, an army of 9,000 men had simply vanished into the morning mist. The British, for all their professional competence and tactical superiority, had been outmaneuvered by an amateur general whose greatest weapons were desperation and divine providence. The strategic implications of the successful evacuation were enormous. Washington had preserved the Continental Army when its destruction seemed certain, maintaining organized resistance that would prove crucial in the long struggle ahead. The retreat demonstrated that American forces, while lacking professional training and equipment, possessed qualities of courage and determination that could not be conquered by superior numbers or tactical skill. Most importantly, it established Washington's reputation as a commander who could salvage victory from the jaws of defeat. As the exhausted survivors of the Battle of Long Island collapsed on the Manhattan shore, many wept openly at their miraculous deliverance from what had seemed certain destruction. They had witnessed defeat transform into salvation, disaster become triumph, and impossible odds overcome by courage, skill, and perhaps divine intervention. The fog that had concealed their escape would be remembered as one of the pivotal moments in American history, when the cause of independence was saved by the intersection of human determination and natural providence. The Battle of Long Island had ended in military defeat, but from that defeat had emerged a deeper victory,